Actually, like for a lot of my books, I don't really know exactly where they started, but for this one, I do have a specific moment where I came up with the first idea for it, and that was when I was out to lunch with some of my friends, and one of them had a shard of bone in her food, and she almost choked on it. Then that got me thinking, well, what if I used bone shards as a system of magic? So my friends now joke that one of them has to experience a near-death experience in order for me to come up with my story ideas. First inkling for it. As for my favorite moment from book one, I think it has to be the moment where Mephi first jumps into Jovis's lap and they make that initial connection with each other. I have pets. When you feel that connection with another creature, it's really magical. Every time I write, I like to start something new. So they don't have any connection to this world or this universe. I really enjoy exploring other worlds and universes. So those were all different. As far as what is going to happen with them, I kind of put them out of sight and out of mind. I think I may try at some point to rewrite some ideas from some of those earlier ones, just because I really liked some of those, but I feel like I'd have to start over. I don't think that what I have there is like my best work. So I feel like a lot of my characters kind of contain aspects of myself. So, you know, I'm very determined, obviously. Lynn is very determined. I tell terrible jokes and I think I'm funny. Jovis does the same thing. As far as anyone who's more closely similar to somebody in my life, I would say probably Jovis's mother is a lot like my mother, which you get to meet her more in the next books, but especially in book two, but definitely like her mannerisms and the way that she is a lot like my mom. She never recognizes herself in my books, which I think is funny, but yeah. If I had to boil it down to 3 words, I would say it's probably struggle for power, because that's a lot of what's happening in book 2 is people are jostling for power politically and also in a military sense. So I always love reading animal companions in books, so I knew that I wanted to write an animal companion. And a lot of it is wish fulfillment. So if I could have any kind of animal companion in the world, what would they be like? And they would be a lot like Mephi. I modeled some of his personality traits after a cat I once had who was extremely mischievous, always getting into things, but also very sweet and affectionate. And that's kind of what I think Mephi's base personality traits are. So first, when I was starting to write it, I was thinking, well, I had to choose between first and third person. So from a very simple perspective, I knew that I just wanted to write both because I didn't want to choose. From a more complicated perspective, I wanted the first person perspectives to be like the 2 main characters that everybody else kind of revolves around. So to delineate that, then I was like, okay, well, these 2 characters are going to be in first person, and the other characters that are kind of orbiting are going to be in third person. So that's how I decided how to handle that. When I first wrote it, romantasy wasn't as big on the scene. I mean, there have always been romantasy books, but it hadn't exploded in the way that it has recently. For me, I always really enjoy a romantic storyline. There is more of one in book 2, but I really wanted to kind of do something a little bit different from what I'd seen. So for example, with Falu and Ranami, I wanted to have 2 characters that weren't going through that first blush of love kind of thing. I wanted to have two characters that were in an established relationship, but were still handling issues between them, because I feel like relationships are not just about that first falling in love, although that's like wonderful and I love it. And I love reading it, but I feel like relationships are kind of this growing together or growing apart. So I kind of wanted to explore these characters that were at that moment of deciding whether they were going to grow together or grow apart. Well, what happens after that initial like happily ever after moment? Like where do you go from here? Because I feel like relationships are not just a line, right? Oh, for sure. I'm glad that you noticed that. I read very widely, so I enjoy reading, horror, literary fiction, science fiction a lot. So I always like to bring elements of those into my work, especially science fiction. I love science fiction, and I read it almost as much as I read fantasy. It's just I haven't really had the opportunity to write science fiction, straight up science fiction, except in short stories. So I really like bringing some of those concepts into fantasy because I feel like it helps to make it a little bit fresher and newer rather than kind of recycling like older ideas. And I just like to get a little weird with things as well. As far as horror aspect, oh, for sure. I'm always fascinated by a little bit of that body horror, which I think is pretty is you can tell in that book. So yeah, for sure I'm planning on doing that in the future. I have another series coming out in the US that has a little bit of that sci-fi aspect in it and also brings in some of those horror aspects and has a little bit more romance as well. So for sure. I think I've always written things that are a little bit stranger and a little bit more off the beaten path. And part of that for me is that I feel like fantasy is so much broader than people first think that it is. I think when you go and you talk to somebody off the street who's never read a fantasy book and you say fantasy, a lot of times they immediately think medieval European swords, knights, dragons, right? Can be so much broader than that. I mean, fantasy means basically anything that you can imagine. So, so to me, I felt like I wanted to kind of go beyond those limits of what people first associate with fantasy. Thank you so much, and thank you to the readers for such wonderful questions.